Have you ever opened your eyes one morning and realized that the child you once nurtured, protected, and poured your heart into now barely hears your voice? One moment you were the center of their world, the one they turned to for guidance and comfort, and now your words seem to vanish into thin air. You sacrificed so much: sleepless nights, long drives to practice, emotional support through every storm. And now you're left wondering when your value faded. Maybe they brush off your advice. Maybe they roll their eyes when you speak. Maybe they treat you like a convenience rather than a parent whose wisdom once shaped their world. But anger won't rebuild the connection. Frustration won't bring back the closeness. You need something stronger, something deeper. In this video, you'll discover 12 powerful shifts, 12 ways to regain your children's respect, not by demanding it, but by quietly becoming the person they want to listen to again. Through boundaries, confidence, and a renewed sense of purpose, you can transform how they see you and how you see yourself. Number 1, realizing the shift in respect. Helen had always been the center of her children's universe. For years, she was the one who knew how to mend scraped knees and broken hearts, the one who made holidays magical and mornings bearable. She remembered the sleepless nights, the carpools, the endless support, every sacrifice, every tear, every joy. Her entire world revolved around her children. But lately, something had changed. One morning, she sat across from her adult son at the kitchen table, sharing a simple story from her childhood, one she thought would bring a smile. He barely looked up from his phone. "That's nice, Mom," he muttered, eyes still scrolling. The words stung more than they should have. It wasn't just the indifference, it was the way her voice seemed to dissolve into the air, unheard, unimportant. The shift hadn't come all at once. It crept in slowly, hidden behind busy schedules, brief conversations, and polite but distant smiles. Helen began to notice the subtle signs, how her suggestions were brushed off, her stories met with sighs, her presence taken for granted. It was like watching herself fade in their eyes, little by little. At first, she blamed herself. Maybe she was overreacting. Maybe they were just stressed. But the ache in her chest grew with every unanswered text and rushed goodbye. And worst of all, the respect she once felt radiating from her children had quietly vanished. Frustration bubbled beneath the surface. She wanted to scream, to remind them of everything she had done, to demand the acknowledgement she deserved. But deep down, she knew that anger wouldn't fix what was broken. It would only push them further away. So Helen took a breath, and in that quiet moment, she made a choice. Not to fight for respect with words, but to rediscover it through presence, strength, and grace. Number 2, why scolding doesn't work. Helen sat alone in her living room, the silence almost mocking. Just hours earlier, she had tried, yet again, to explain to her daughter how hurtful the dismissive tone had become. "You never listen anymore," she had said, voice rising with emotion. "After everything I've done for you, is it too much to ask for a little respect?" But instead of understanding, her daughter rolled her eyes and walked away, muttering, "There you go again, making everything about you." The door closed with a soft thud, but to Helen, it sounded like finality. That night, her mind spiraled. Should she have shouted louder? Listed out every sacrifice she'd made? Shown the receipts, the sleepless nights, the dreams she'd put on hold? Her heart said yes. Her pride said yes. But something deeper whispered no, because the truth was becoming clearer. Guilt doesn't bring back respect. Nagging only builds walls. Each argument left her feeling emptier and her daughter more distant. It wasn't a lack of love that created this gap. It was a lack of boundaries, a lack of clarity. Helen had been so afraid to lose the relationship that she tolerated too much, hoping that her silence would keep the peace. But silence hadn't earned her respect, and loud voices hadn't either. So Helen tried something new. She started listening to herself. She asked the hard questions. What do I need? Where did I lose myself in all this? Instead of demanding change, she began setting quiet limits. Instead of chasing validation, she nurtured her own emotional well-being. And little by little, the energy shifted. She didn't need to scold. She didn't need to plead. She just needed to remember her worth and live like it. Number 5. Respect comes from self-worth, not sacrifice. Helen had always been the one everyone relied on. She was the problem solver, the peacekeeper, the one who always said yes. For years, her children praised her as the glue that held the family together. Need a babysitter at the last minute? She was there. Change dinner plans 3 times? No problem. Let them decide everything from where to meet to what time to talk? Of course. At first, it felt like love. Being needed gave her purpose. She believed that constant giving, constant flexibility was the cost of staying close. But over time, she noticed something unsettling. Her voice no longer mattered. Her daughter would plan family events without asking for her input. Her son would interrupt her mid-sentence, assuming his opinion was more important. They didn't even seem to notice when she stayed quiet, or when she canceled her own appointments to fit into their schedules. One day, sitting alone in the quiet of her apartment, Helen caught her reflection in the window. She didn't recognize the woman staring back. Where had that vibrant, assertive woman gone? The one who used to speak up in meetings, organize charity events, and command a room with her confidence? She realized, with a heavy heart, that in trying to keep the peace, she had sacrificed her presence. And worse, her children didn't respect her more for it. They respected her less. So, Helen made a decision. No more silent dinners, no more agreeing just to be agreeable. She began carving out space for herself. Small choices at first, like picking the restaurant or declining last-minute demands. The world didn't fall apart. But something else happened. Her children paused. They listened. And slowly they began to see her again. Not just as a convenience, but as a woman with needs, opinions, and worth. Respect hadn't come from all she gave. It came when she finally chose to give to herself. Number 4, stop seeking their approval. For most of her life, Helen had measured her worth by how happy her children were. If they smiled, she'd done her job. If they called, her day was made. Their approval wasn't just comforting, it became her compass. So when their calls became fewer, their responses shorter, and their tone more indifferent, Helen felt lost. She started overcompensating, offering to help even when she was exhausted, agreeing with opinions she disagreed with, laughing at jokes that stung a little too much. All in the name of keeping the peace. All in the hope that they'd love her more if she just gave a little more. But the more she tried to please them, the more distant they became. Her efforts weren't bringing them closer. They were pushing her further into the background. Every time she withheld how she truly felt just to avoid friction, she faded a little more in their eyes. Then one evening, while sitting through yet another family dinner where her voice was politely ignored, something inside her shifted. She realized she was chasing something that should never have needed chasing: respect. From that moment on, she made a promise to herself: no more shrinking to fit into their expectations. No more sacrificing her truth for their comfort. She began speaking her mind, not with anger, but with honesty. She said no when she meant it. She stopped calling 3 times a week just to fill the silence. She let them come to her. At first, the change confused them. They pushed back, tested her. But Helen held steady, and something remarkable happened. They began listening more carefully. They asked for her thoughts. They started to see her not as someone desperate for approval, but as someone who already had it from within. Helen hadn't just reclaimed her voice. She reclaimed their respect. Number 5, lead with dignity, not arguments. There was a time when Helen's words carried weight. As a retired teacher, she had once commanded classrooms full of restless students with calm authority and unwavering presence. But at home, with her own children, that presence seemed to vanish. They interrupted her, dismissed her advice, even chuckled at her concerns. The woman who once stood tall before hundreds now felt invisible around her own kitchen table. At first, Helen did what most would do. She pushed back. She reminded them of the years she'd devoted to raising them. She listed the sacrifices, the sleepless nights, the unwavering support. She argued, defended, and demanded. But the harder she tried, the more they pulled away. Her words, once respected, now sounded like noise. And then, Helen remembered the classroom. She hadn't earned her students' respect by shouting or demanding obedience. She had earned it by showing quiet strength, by listening intently, by speaking with clarity, by standing firm when it mattered most. So she changed her approach. Instead of arguing, she began listening, truly listening. When she spoke, it was measured, thoughtful, intentional. If a conversation turned tense, she allowed silence to do what shouting never could. She didn't try to win every point. She chose grace over control, presence over persuasion. And her children noticed. They leaned in a little closer. They paused before interrupting. They began asking what she thought, not out of duty, but out of genuine interest. Without a single raised voice, Helen reclaimed her place, not through force, but through quiet dignity. She didn't need to prove her worth. She lived it. And in that stillness, her children rediscovered something they had long forgotten. Their mother's voice was not only worth hearing, it was worth respecting. Number 6, reclaim emotional independence. Helen used to wait by the phone. Every ring, every text notification made her heart leap with hope. Most days it wasn't her children calling, so she called them, often, sometimes twice in one day. She'd ask how they were, offer to help, hint that she missed them. At first, they responded with patience, but over time, the tone changed, conversations grew shorter, the energy felt strained. She told herself it was just life. They were busy, overwhelmed. But deep down, Helen knew something else was happening. Her constant need to be needed had become a quiet burden. Then came the day she decided to stop waiting. Instead of pacing near her phone, she signed up for an art class she'd always wanted to try. She met friends for coffee, joined a local volunteer group, and filled her days with color, laughter, and purpose. Slowly, her life began to revolve around her passions, her joy, not around whether or not her kids would call. And that's when everything shifted. Without the weight of her emotional needs pressing down on them, her children began to reach out more. Not out of guilt or obligation, but out of genuine interest. They wanted to hear about her new paintings, her projects, her adventures. Helen had stopped chasing their attention, and somehow that made them pay more. She wasn't pulling away from her family. She was simply returning to herself. In reclaiming her emotional independence, Helen became magnetic, an inspiration rather than an expectation. She didn't demand connection, she attracted it. And her children, now free from the pressure to be her source of happiness, found something even more valuable: admiration. The kind that grows when someone you love shows you they can shine on their own. Number 7, balance love with boundaries. For years, Helen believed that patience and silence were the keys to a peaceful family. She tolerated the interruptions, the sarcastic remarks, the way her children talked over her like she wasn't even in the room. She told herself it wasn't worth the argument, that if she stayed quiet, they'd eventually come around. That love meant letting things go. But something inside her began to crack. It was during a family dinner when her son rolled his eyes and said, "Mom, can we not do this right now?" after she gently offered advice. She laughed it off, as always. But that night, lying in bed, Helen realized something chilling. They weren't just ignoring her. They were learning that it was okay to. She thought being the easygoing mom would keep everyone close. But in reality, her children were mistaking her silence for weakness. Her tolerance was being taken as permission. And her love, boundless, unwavering, had become background noise. So Helen made a choice. Not an angry one, a strong one. She started small. Let's not interrupt each other, okay? Or, if we can't speak respectfully, I'll step away from this conversation. No shouting, no guilt tripping, just calm, firm truth. At first, it rattled her children. They pushed back. One even called her too sensitive. But Helen didn't flinch. She repeated herself gently, consistently, and slowly the dynamic began to change. They interrupted less. They listened more. They adjusted. Not because she demanded it, but because she finally drew the line. Helen's boundaries weren't walls. They were invitations, clear signals that said, "I love you, but I also love myself." And in standing up for that truth, she reminded her children of something they'd forgotten: that love without respect isn't love at all. Number 8, respect through consistent boundaries. Helen used to think that letting things slide was a form of grace. When her daughter brushed off her advice on nutrition, despite Helen's decades as a nurse, she simply smiled and let it go. When her son cut her off mid-sentence, she laughed awkwardly and changed the subject. She thought she was keeping the peace. What she was really doing was erasing herself. But it only got worse. The more she stayed quiet, the bolder the dismissiveness became. Her professional experience was treated like outdated trivia, her time taken for granted, her opinions optional. And yet, Helen kept hoping they'd see her, hoping they'd remember who she was. It wasn't until a phone call with her daughter that something snapped. Once again, Helen offered a gentle suggestion about her grandson's diet and was met with a snide, "Mom, you're not his doctor." There was a pause, long and heavy. For the first time in years, Helen didn't brush it off. Instead, she answered with quiet resolve, "If my input doesn't matter, I won't offer it anymore." Her daughter didn't respond right away. In fact, she ended the call quickly. But a few weeks later, something changed. Her daughter called, not to argue, but to ask. About vitamins, about childhood allergies, about things Helen knew deeply, professionally, personally. The tone was different, softer, curious, respectful. Helen hadn't begged for acknowledgement. She had simply stepped back from where she wasn't valued and waited. That boundary wasn't a punishment. It was a mirror, one that showed her children what life looked like without her wisdom freely given. And in its absence, they remembered its worth. From that day on, Helen didn't offer advice unless it was genuinely wanted. But when she did, her words landed. They mattered. Because she'd taught them, through quiet consistency, that her voice was not a given. It was a gift. Number 9, stop overgiving and enabling. Helen had always said yes. Need money for a down payment? She'd write the check. Last-minute babysitting? She'd cancel her plans. Hosting the family dinner even when she was exhausted? Of course. Saying no had never been part of her vocabulary. After all, wasn't that what love looked like? But the thank yous became rare. The favors turned into expectations. Her time, her money, her energy, no longer appreciated, just assumed. Her kindness had transformed into a silent contract she never agreed to, one where giving was endless and gratitude optional. Then one afternoon, she found herself lugging groceries up her porch steps, alone, after preparing an entire meal her children had insisted on, only to cancel at the last minute. She stood there, arms full, heart heavier. That was the moment it hit her. She wasn't helping anymore. She was enabling. She stopped saying yes to everything. The next time her son asked for a favor, she replied, "I can help, but only if it works for me too." When her daughter assumed she'd cancel her plans to babysit, Helen gently said, "I'm not available that day, but I hope you find someone." At first, they were confused, some even annoyed, but Helen held her ground. She gave only when she truly wanted to, and when it didn't cost her peace. And soon something shifted. Their requests became more thoughtful, their tone more respectful. And surprisingly, their gratitude returned. Helen hadn't withdrawn her love. She'd just stopped letting it be exploited. And in doing so, she reminded her children that her generosity was a blessing, not a bottomless resource. True love doesn't mean losing yourself. It means giving from a place of strength, not sacrifice. And when Helen finally drew that line, her children didn't walk away. They stepped up. Number 10, build a life outside your children. After her husband passed, Helen's world quietly shrank. Her days revolved around her children, checking in, offering help, waiting for calls that rarely came. She filled the silence with updates on their lives, scrolled endlessly through their social media, and waited for the next birthday or holiday to feel needed again. She didn't realize it right away, but her identity had become tethered to them. Not as people, but as proof that she still mattered. Then came the evening she called her son just to chat, and he answered with a sigh. "Mom, I'm really busy. Can this wait?" The words stung, not because they were cruel, but because they were true. She had nothing to talk about except him, nothing new of her own to share. That night, Helen made a decision, not out of bitterness, but out of self-respect. The next morning, she signed up for a local book club. A week later, she joined a hiking group for seniors. She volunteered at the animal shelter, started painting again, and even took a weekend trip with a few new friends. The days filled up, not with waiting, but with living. And then the phone started ringing. Her daughter called just to ask how her painting class was going. Her son texted for photos from her hike. They were curious, genuinely curious, because Helen had become someone new again. Not the mom who sat by the phone, but the woman with stories, laughter, and light in her eyes. Her life had grown larger, and her presence more powerful. She hadn't distanced herself from her children. She just reclaimed the parts of herself she had set aside for too long. And in doing so, she became someone they didn't just feel obligated to call. She became someone they wanted to know. Number 11, respect is inspired, not demanded. Helen once believed that if she just reminded her children often enough of the sacrifices she made, the nights she stayed awake, the love she gave, they'd treat her with the respect she deserved. She thought that if they only realized how much she had done, they would naturally want to give back. But every time she brought it up, their faces hardened. The more she tried to explain her pain, the more they pulled away. One afternoon, after another strained conversation with her daughter, Helen sat alone and whispered a question into the silence. "Why doesn't it work? Why don't they see me?" Then, the truth hit her. Respect doesn't grow from guilt. It doesn't respond to lectures or lists of past deeds. It isn't something you can demand. It's something you live. So Helen changed the way she showed up. She stopped trying to prove her worth. She stopped chasing their approval. Instead, she focused on how she carried herself. Calm, confident, clear. She let her boundaries speak louder than her words. When conversations turned disrespectful, she didn't argue. She ended them quietly. When someone crossed a line, she didn't explain why it hurt. She stepped back. It was uncomfortable at first, lonely even. But slowly, the shift began. Her children noticed the change, not because she forced it, but because they felt it. Her presence no longer begged for attention. It commanded it. Her silence wasn't passive. It was powerful. And without a single demand, their behavior began to change. Helen realized that the most powerful message she could send wasn't, "You owe me respect." It was, "I respect myself." And when she lived that truth, her children finally followed. Not because she asked, but because she inspired it. Number 12, live with purpose and fulfillment. Helen had spent so many years centering her life around her children that she'd forgotten what her own dreams looked like. She once loved music, dreamed of visiting Paris, imagined herself writing a memoir. But those passions had slowly faded, replaced by routines, responsibilities, and waiting. Waiting for birthdays, waiting for visits, waiting for a call that said, "We need you." She didn't realize how deeply she disappeared until one quiet afternoon, sitting by the window, she asked herself, "If my children stopped calling, what would be left of me?" The answer shattered her. That night, she made a promise, one not to her children, but to herself. "I will build a life that belongs to me." And she did. She pulled her dusty keyboard out of the closet and played for the first time in decades. She took a solo trip to a coastal town she'd only seen in magazines. She wrote stories about her childhood and shared them at a local reading circle. Her calendar, once blank, filled with art shows, cooking classes, and laughter with friends who hadn't seen her light in years. And something unexpected happened. Her children began to reach out, not just more often, but with a new tone. "Mom, you're glowing in that photo. Tell me about your trip. I never knew you loved jazz." They weren't just checking in. They were curious, intrigued, proud. Because Helen had become more than a mother waiting in the wings. She had become a woman who radiated purpose. She no longer lived for their attention. And ironically, that made them want to give it. Not out of guilt, not out of duty, but out of genuine admiration for the person she had become. And in finding herself again, Helen didn't lose her children. She finally, truly reconnected with them. Final reflection. One evening, Helen stood in front of her mirror, brushing her hair before bed. She looked at herself, really looked, and asked the question she'd been avoiding for years. Does my happiness depend on whether my children notice me? The answer wasn't easy to face. For too long, she had measured her worth by how often they called, how quickly they replied, how much they needed her. She had built her identity around their lives, hoping that love would always return in the way she gave it. But now, staring at her own reflection, Helen saw someone else emerging. Someone stronger. Someone who no longer waited for respect, but lived in a way that demanded it without a single word. She thought about the changes she'd made, the boundaries she'd set, the passions she'd rekindled, the silence she no longer feared, and the conversations she now controlled with grace, not desperation. She no longer begged for recognition. She embodied it. Helen had stopped chasing approval and started living with intention. She carried herself with quiet pride, made choices rooted in self-worth, and spoke with a voice that no longer wavered. And through that transformation, something remarkable had unfolded. Her children began to treat her differently, not because she demanded it, but because she became different. Not a mother clinging to the past, but a woman standing confidently in her present. Respect, she realized, doesn't come from sacrifice alone. It comes from showing the world and those you love that you are whole, even when no one's watching. And as she turned off the light that night, Helen felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: peace. Because she finally understood. When you live with dignity and purpose, you don't have to ask for respect. It finds its way back to you. So now the question is yours to answer. What will you choose today to begin reclaiming the respect you deserve? Maybe it's a small no where you used to say yes. Maybe it's enrolling in that class you've always put off. Maybe it's simply allowing yourself to be more than a parent for the first time in a long time. This journey isn't about distancing yourself from your children. It's about returning to yourself. Because when you begin to live with intention, with boundaries, and with a heart full of your own passions, everything else starts to shift. You become someone they admire, someone they want to learn from, someone they respect, not because they're supposed to, but because they see you again. And that's where true connection begins, not in sacrifice, but in self-worth. So go ahead, take the first step. Your next chapter is waiting, and it starts with you.